Yanna Titova, and I will be speaking about a very interesting topic, which is about a refugee policy called the wet foot, dry foot policy. After the end of World War II, the world's two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, entered a Cold War. A Cold War consists of indirect fighting and indirect conflicts and threats, as opposed to a hot war where there is direct fighting between two sides. At this time, the United States came up with a refugee policy where they admitted people immediately if they were escaping communist countries. However, even though the Cold War has ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in December of 1991, the United States continues to extend this policy by favoring Cuban refugees because of Cuba's communist form of government. However, there is a small twist to this where the only way that a Cuban can be a refugee in the United States is if he or she can make it to the shore of the United States and be considered dry foot, while a Cuban that is intercepted at sea and doesn't exactly make it to the United States yet is considered wet feet and is sent back to Cuba or to another country if they fear persecution. Now you may wonder, how did all of this begin? Let's travel to December of 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. The Soviet Union was a huge source of aid for Cuba, and so with its collapse, Cuba's economy worsened and poverty quickly spread. Cubans began to travel to the United States in order to improve their lifestyle, and in that year alone, over 35,000 Cubans traveled to the United States and flooded Florida. This posed as a huge problem, and so in 1994, the United States and Cuba decided to make an agreement where the United States told Cuba they will give them 20,000 visas annually for Cubans to enter the United States. Since 1959, when Fidel Castro came into power, Cubans have been traveling to the United States in order to reunite with their families or to just create a better lifestyle for themselves. And so when these 20,000 visas were limiting how many people could come, they started searching for other means. In addition, even though 20,000 visas were made available to Cubans, not all of them were issued because of lack of resources and staff in order to process all the applications. Cubans began to enter the United States either through the Mexico-US border, and they were referred to as dusty feet, or through a more direct, shorter route, which is directly from Cuba to the United States, which is what we're going to focus on. The Cuban Adjustment Act is a United States federal law that was enacted on November 2nd, 1966. Simply stated, it just means that anybody that left Cuba and was inspected and admitted or paroled into the United States after January 1st, 1959 would be allowed to become a permanent resident if they resided in the United States for at least 1 year. After the mass migration in 1991, the Clinton administration spoke to the Cuban government and they agreed that they will still continue with the Cuban Adjustment Act, but that the United States will stop admitting people that they find at sea. This became known as the wet foot, dry foot policy. A Cuban that is caught in the water between the two nations is considered to have wet feet and is therefore sent home back to Cuba or to a third country if they fear that they are being persecuted back in Cuba. A Cuban that can make it to the dry shore of the United States is considered as dry feet, and that person gets a chance to remain in the United States and later qualify for legal permanent residentship under the Cuban Adjustment Act and eventually become a U.S. citizen. America monitors whether the returned Cubans are subject to persecution with the U.S. Interest Section Havana and in cooperation with the international organizations in order to make sure that these Cubans are not being persecuted for trying to escape from Cuba. And they saw that Cuba really has no any sort of legal means of persecuting these people, of punishing them for trying to escape, and Cuba even agreed that they will not have take any sort of action against these Cubans unless they face other criminal charges. So Cubans that do make it to the dry shore of the United States, they are inspected by the Department of Homeland Security, and they're usually allowed to stay in the United States. And after 1 year, they are eligible to apply for a chance in legal status that makes them eligible for an immigrant visa, permanent residence, and eventually U.S. citizenship. And this policy only applies to Cubans because undocumented Haitian or Dominican migrants who may reach the U.S. shores, they are not automatically eligible. So this is something that only applies to Cubans. The water of Florida, they're constantly patrolled by Border Patrol and the U.S. Coast Guard. They use patrol boats, cutters, and aircraft in order to make sure that people are not getting into the United States illegally. However, it is estimated that even with all of this protection, more than 16,000 Cubans are able to make it successfully to the United States. As far as how many Cubans die every year, nobody really knows because neither the Coast Guard nor the State Department nor human rights groups keep statistics on these fatalities at sea. During the Balsero crisis of 1994, however, they found that between 25% to 75% of people trying to make it to the United States died at sea. And as human smugglers began to use more sophisticated boats as time went on, they found that fatalities probably lessened, but nobody is still sure because records are not kept. There are several state case studies on people escaping Cuba and making it to the United States or getting sent back. And one of them that is very well publicized is an incident that happened in June 1999. There were 6 Cuban refugees that were trying to reach the United States by boat, a very small boat that they made. And in order to keep them out, the Coast Guard blasted a water cannon at this boat, which sunk the boat and threw the Cubans into the water. And as they were attempting to swim towards shore, the Coast Guard came in their vessel and just made circles around these men in order to block aid. And one of the swimmers actually even got pepper sprayed in the face. Eventually, 4 of the Cubans were put into the vessel and 2 were able to make it to shore, where there was a cheering crowd of people, since there are a lot of Cubans that made it to America in the same way. And as soon as these men made it to shore, there were cops waiting for them there, where they threw them on the ground in their underwear or swimsuits and arrested them. People were outraged, and there were many protesters that wanted these men freed, and they were just very outraged with the way they were treated. Finally, after a lot of protesting, these 6 men were set free and were allowed to become permanent residents of the United States. And that's when there was this major confusion with what exactly is the U.S. shore. It could be some say the U.S. territorial limits is 12 miles, while the INS is saying that if you're ankle deep in water, you're still at sea. So you can be walking towards the shore, you can just have barely any water on your feet, and they'll consider you wet feet and send you back to Cuba. Another example is one that occurred on January 5th, 2006, when the Coast Guard found 15 Cubans, including 4 women and 2 children, that climbed onto a piling of the old 7-mile bridge in Florida Keys. This bridge is no longer in use and has been cut away from the land. And so the Coast Guard that found them decided that since they could not make it to the United States shore and have completely dry feet, then they are technically wet feet and should be sent back to Cuba. These people were sent back to Cuba, and this also got some publicity, and a man named Ramon Saul Sanchez, who is an exiled activist and a leader of the democracy movement, was so upset he decided that he's going to lead a hunger strike against this policy, and he went on with it for 11 days until the White House agreed to meet with him at a later date. On February 28, 2007, a federal judge ruled that they truly did treat these Cubans unfairly, and they decided that they are going to bring them back to the United States. On December 15, 2006, 14 out of 15 of these Cubans were given migrant visas and were allowed to stay in the United States. Many human rights were violated as well as promoted with this wet foot, dry foot policy. One that was promoted is Article 14, where it states that everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. So even though Cubans may not have an exact choice if they are caught at sea where they are going to stay as refugees at, they do not automatically get sent back to Cuba. If they fear for their lives, they do get interviewed and then they are sent to a third country. That is, unless they make it to the United States, then they do have a choice. They are able to stay in the United States. And And Articles 13 and 15, on the other hand, are violated because both of them talk about the right to people, the right that people have in choosing where they live and in moving back and forth, like from their country to the country of their choice. And obviously these Cubans don't really have much of a choice in moving to one country or another. It's either they make it or they don't. It's just pretty much gambling. And so those are violated because these Cubans are not given much of a choice of where they live. And Articles 1 and Article 2 are also violated. Article 1 states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And Article 2 states that everyone is entitled to all rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration, despite of their race, sex, of their religion, of their color. And so these two are violated because the people who they make it to the shore of the United States, they are not everyone is treated equally. The Cubans, they get certain rights that other people do not get because they are Cubans. And so this is the treatment where everyone is not treated equally, because if someone from another country is trying to also seek refuge in the United States and they make it to the shore, they are not automatically allowed to stay there as a Cuban is. And so even though the wet foot, dry foot policy prevented a massive migration like the one we saw in 1991 after the fall of communism in the Soviet Union, and so it stopped the huge migration that the United States fears, it also established a more normal migration, the kind that Cuba seeks. But both Americans and Cuba do seem to agree that this policy isn't completely fair. And so hopefully sometime in the future, sometime soon, I'm thinking, we are going to see some kind of change to this refugee policy. Thank you.